Following Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, after the West collectively put its foot down with sanctions, Russia's president had to get sneaky. Using ships registered to Russia wouldn't work anymore, as they could be tracked and, if necessary, stopped. But what about those ships that hide their identities? Those that are difficult to track and have no direct links to Russia? They would work, and that's how the Shadow Fleet came to be. To keep money flowing into its war chest as it loses billions to the Ukraine war it started, Russia has relied on this fleet, which often sails out of the Baltic Sea. Now, that's about to end. Putin is in big trouble as Denmark has just cut off Russia's Baltic Sea lifeline. Denmark's solution to the Shadow Fleet problem is brilliant. As Tradewinds reported on October 6th, a completely legal method is being planned by Denmark to take Putin's Shadow Fleet vessels out of commission. It won't be sending fighter jets or launching missiles to sink those ships in the Baltic Sea. Instead, something it has been doing all along is simply going to be stepped up to a point where Russia's shady ships won't be able to pass any longer. The Shadow Fleet is going to be sunk by more ship inspections. Specifically, Denmark is going to pour more effort and resources into conducting environmental checks on what it calls old and worn out ships at the Sky and Red anchorage, Tradewinds says. That anchorage is one of the key gateways for vessels passing to and from the Baltic Sea, the outlet says. According to the official Port of Skyen website, every single year, about 60,000 ships pass north of Denmark and through the anchorage. This is a very active port, a fact Russia has been taking advantage of to sneak its Shadow Fleet ships through. That isn't going to happen anymore, as Denmark says that it's going to keep a closer eye on the ships that pass through the anchorage than ever before. Increased scrutiny of scrubber water discharge and fuel requirements is on the agenda, Tradewinds says. Even closer attention will also be paid by Denmark to how ships handle waste management, and its scrutiny of scrapping certificates will also be improved. Basically, all of the signs that a ship could be part of the Shadow Fleet are now going to be on Denmark's radar. Theoretically, this should mean that many Shadow Fleet ships, which are often uninsured or otherwise unsuitable for conducting the journeys on which Russia sends them, will be caught and stopped before they can deliver their money-making oil cargoes to buyers. The logic is very simple. Cutting off the flow of money into Russia would mean stopping the ships. Without money from oil, under the cost of a war believed to be costing the country around $1 billion per day, Russia may drown. The move was announced by Denmark's Industry and Trade Minister, Morten Bodskov, who made it crystal clear that Denmark has the Shadow Fleet in its sights with its improved inspections. We must put an end to Putin's war machine. This also applies to the Russian Shadow Fleet, Bodskov said. We know from our safety checks at Sky and Red that among these ships, there are old and worn-out ships sailing around. That is why our authorities are now intensifying the controls so that we look after Denmark and Danish waters. Funds have already been earmarked for the new inspections, which will also see more inspectors board vessels to enable the higher level of scrutiny promised. Its simplicity is what makes the move genius. And here's the reason why. When sanctions were levied by the West against Russian oil, much of Russia's existing fleet of ships was put out of commission. These ships were generally modern and seaworthy, had the relevant insurance documents. To ensure they abided by all international environmental laws, they were maintained to a certain standard. With those ships no longer able to sail, Putin resorted to the mass purchase of vessels he could use to form his Shadow Fleet. That alone was problematic enough. However, a major issue that often goes unreported is that from environmental and safety perspectives, many Shadow Fleet vessels are actively hazardous. Marine Insight revealed why, in an August 2025 article discussing how the Shadow Fleet has been growing at a rate of about 30 ships per month. Shadow Fleet ships are over 15 years old and in poor condition, with no proper insurance coverage. They sail under flags of convenience to hide their real ownership and use risky ways to evade being caught or detected, such as turning off eyes and performing dangerous ship transfers in international waters, the outlet says. The part that is really relevant here is about the ships being 15 years old or more. On average, oil tankers have lifespans of around 20 to 25 years, Fox reported in March 2024. That may seem like the Shadow Fleet ships are well within their sell-by dates. However, the outlet adds that once they reach the 15-year mark, most reputable tanker operators tend to sell their vessels. That's how Putin has been getting his hands on so many ships for the Shadow Fleet. These are tankers that their past operators no longer want because the maintenance burden is too high, and it's more cost-effective to run modern tankers than it is those that are starting to show their age. For Russia, tanker age isn't a problem. As long as it isn't sinking, a tanker can be a part of the shadow fleet. While Putin may not care about the age of his shady oil tankers, the rest of Europe does. The older a ship gets, the more likely it is to start causing some serious environmental problems. Components start to degrade. The ship may not meet modern emissions standards. And just think about what these tankers are carrying gallons upon gallons of oil. For a massive oil leak into the Baltic Sea or elsewhere to take place, it only takes one disaster, such as an aging tanker finally giving up the ghost midway through a journey. These types of concerns have been around for a long time. In March 2023, Bloomberg published a piece in which it profiled an oil tanker named Turba. At 26 years old, that vessel should have been sent to the scrapyard. It hadn't completed a full inspection since 2017, and for the job it was doing, it wasn't carrying the industry standard insurance. But Putin was still using it, along with dozens of other ships that should have long since been taken off the water. The same outlet also highlights what was mentioned earlier about how tankers nearing the end of their work, lifespans become too expensive to maintain. Tankers normally receive inspections, known as special surveys, about every 5 years, Bloomberg says. By the fourth time around, the economics of continuing to trade diminish sharply. The surveys can cost $3 million to $4 million for big tankers, and they will then require an intermediate inspection about 2.5 years later. That's a lot of money to spend on inspections. Most reputable tanker owners replace rather than absorb that cost. Russia is doing neither. The almost inevitable results are already starting to appear. On October 6th, TVP World reported that several of Russia's decrepit shadow fleet ships are already causing serious environmental problems. The outlet cites a joint report created by Politico and source material that says Russia is operating at least 5 blacklisted tankers that have been identified as leaving massive oil slicks behind as they sail the ocean. These slicks don't amount to a catastrophe. However, they show Russia's complete lack of regard for environmental protection and the safety of the crews aboard its shady ships. How long will it be before a major spill is caused by a shadow fleet vessel? Hopefully, it will never happen. But the signs are there that Putin is happy to keep sending out ancient ships until they literally can T-sail anymore. The European Union, or EU, has a particular problem with this approach. Under the FuelEU Maritime Framework, along with the Mediterranean's Emission Control Areas, or ECA, limits are being placed on ship emissions and carbon intensity. The former framework mandates that all ships achieve progressive reductions of their carbon intensity. These reductions will start at 2% in 2025, with the intention being that an 80% reduction will have been achieved by all ships sailing in EU waters by 2050. The ECA limits ships' sulfur emissions to 0.1%, a standard that already exists in the Baltic and North Seas. The points here are simple. The EU wants to drive carbon emissions down, meaning it has an intense focus on the environmental aspects of shipping oil and cargo over long distances. With its shadow fleet, Russia is flat-out ignoring frameworks designed to support these environmental policies. And that's where the brilliance of Denmark's inspections comes into play. The country can justify the increased scrutiny under these EU and Mediterranean frameworks. Russia is left with no real recourse. If it tries to argue against the checks that Denmark is going to carry out, it essentially admits that the vessels most likely to be stopped belong to the shadow fleet. That defeats the purpose. By their nature, shadow fleet ships aren't supposed to have any direct ties to Russia, so Denmark can stop these old ships from sailing. It's not like Russia has many more options for getting in and out of the Baltic Sea either. As War on the Rocks notes, the Baltic Sea is accessible via a trio of chokepoints. One of them is Skagerrak, which is the location of Sky in Red. The other is Kattegat. Both are controlled by NATO nations, with Norway and Sweden adding to the Danish presence. If those two countries follow Denmark's lead, shadow fleet ships are severely limited in their options. Even worse for Russia, the outlet says, all east and northbound ships in the Baltic Sea have to pass by Denmark's Bornholm Island. That island is relevant to what Denmark is doing in the Baltic for a different reason. More on that later in the video. These types of obstructions represent the very last thing that Putin wants to be happening in the Baltic Sea, because the shadow fleet is absolutely essential to Russia's ability to continue the Ukraine war. That's evident from the sheer amount of money that Russia has invested in these old vessels. despite the ships that comprise the Shadow Fleet being near or even beyond their intended lifespans. They still cost money. According to Craig Kennedy's Navigating Russia, since May 2022, Putin has plowed $14 billion into buying Shadow Fleet ships. This has been great for some unscrupulous European and American ship owners. Sprawling follow the money investigation reports, finding they've collectively made at least $6.3 billion out of Putin's desperation. It seems unlikely that the West is going to be able to do anything about the sale of these types of ships at the source. Measures like what Denmark is introducing can at least ensure Russia wastes its money after buying a shady ship. Putin has spent all of this money for a reason. As Jamie Shee of Friends of Europe notes, oil is one of Russia's most profitable exports. Last year, she says, referring to 2024, the Kremlin pulled in $16.4 billion from oil sales to finance its war effort in Ukraine. It was 5% more than in 2023. These oil sales allow Moscow to stabilize the ruble, control its budget deficit, and keep its balance of payments and credit so that it has money to pay for its imports. The Shadow Fleet is instrumental to ensuring Russia can balance the books, not just for the Ukraine war, but in terms of Russia's entire economy. The UK government adds that its July 2025 sanctions against 135 of the oil tankers that make up the Shadow Fleet are supposed to target a group of vessels responsible for transporting $24 billion of cargo since the beginning of 2024. That amounts to an approximate annual revenue of $16 billion for Russia, which more than justifies the $14 billion Putin has invested into the Shadow Fleet. The EU is also sanctioning ships. About 444 of Russia's Shadow Fleet ships are already blacklisted, with another 120 vessels likely to be added as part of the EU's latest round of sanctions. Barriers against Russia's Shadow Fleet are being put up all over the place via sanctions. Now Denmark is creating a literal barrier. And any shady ship that tries to pass through Skåne Red is going to be in its crosshairs. Some might argue that this level of scrutiny within the Baltic Sea should have been applied a long time ago. Perhaps they would have a point. It's easy to interpret Denmark's decision to strengthen its inspections as an acknowledgement that it was indeed doing enough to stop Shadow Fleet ships in the past. However, it's possible that Denmark has been pushed into action by a series of recent incidents indicating that it's not just Ukraine that is being threatened by Russia and its military ambitions. Denmark is on Putin's radar too. Just a few days before Denmark announced its new initiative, Reuters carried a report on several Russian naval provocations that have occurred in the various straits that Denmark controls. These provocations included Russian warships purposefully sailing on collision courses with other ships and the aiming of weapons at Danish naval vessels. GPS jamming equipment has also been activated by Russia's ships to hinder other vessels. Denmark's Defense Intelligence Service Director Thomas Arnkiel revealed all at an October press conference. He revealed that one Russian warship had been anchored in Danish waters for over a week, likely to serve as a constant threatening presence against Denmark and any other vessel that might pass by. We have seen several incidents in the Danish Straits where Danish Air Force helicopters and naval vessels have been targeted by tracking radars and physically pointed at with weapons from Russian warships, Arnkiel added. Russia is using military means, including in an aggressive way, to put pressure on us without crossing the line into armed conflict in a traditional sense. So, Russia is going to use unconventional means to threaten Denmark? What better response than one that Russia would never have seen coming? Rather than attempting to intimidate Russia right back, Denmark is exercising a right that it has always had to indirectly hurt the Russian military in a way that Putin could never have expected. Diminishing the effectiveness of the Shadow Fleet in any way will weaken Russia's military. That's the entire purpose of sanctions. Now, with its increased ship inspections, Denmark has found a novel way to overcome a uniquely Russian problem. That's not to say that Denmark isn't doing other things to limit Russia's impact and presence in the Baltic Sea. In addition to the unconventional, it has more traditional ways of letting Russia know that it means business. Denmark's stronger inspections are just part of a wider Baltic plan that will see it strike back against Russia in several ways. Getting ready is one of those ways. In September, the Danish defense website reported that Denmark was among 14 nations that took part in a Baltic Sea maritime exercise named Northern Coasts. The country sent one of its frigates and all of its mine clearance vessels to take part in an exercise where it trained for tactical maritime warfare in coastal waters. Part of the exercise focused on ensuring free navigation through the Baltic Sea for all vessels that Russia might try to target with its hybrid warfare, which shows Putin that he'll have a lot more to worry about than stringent shadow fleet inspections if he tries to push Denmark too far. Back in June, Denmark also announced that it was going to deploy floating sail drones into the Baltic Sea. These unmanned vessels, which are made by a company based in California, look like sailing boats but are really data collection hubs. They're loaded with sensors, cameras, and radars that, when combined with onboard artificial intelligence, allow them to depict a more detailed image of maritime activity than other surveillance methods, such as satellite navigation. These sail drones might allow Denmark to identify more shadow fleet ships, especially those that are involved in the attempted destruction of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea, The Guardian reports. Oh, and remember that island mentioned earlier in the video. It's the one that all east and northbound ships have to sail by to pass in or out of the Baltic Sea. That scrap of land is called Bornholm Island, and it's going to start serving as much more than a lookout point. On September 8th, the Nordic reporter said that Denmark is building up a military presence on this small island. Dubbed the Bornholm Regiment, this presence is the 10th such unit created as part of the Danish army, and it will contain between 500 and 900 personnel. It'll be equipped with 15 Patria 6x6 armored personnel vehicles, each of which can hold up to 10 soldiers. This new regiment will also add to the force of around 200 people that Denmark has stationed at Bornholm Island in the past. This may not seem like a huge move on its own. However, Denmark doesn't have a particularly large military. Right now, its military only has around 23,000 active personnel, though Denmark has plans to increase this number to 28,000 by 2033. Sending around 1,000 soldiers to a single island demonstrates that Denmark is taking its Baltic Sea responsibilities extremely seriously. The militarization of Bornholm Island may be minor when taken in isolation, but when combined with everything else that Denmark is doing in the Baltic Sea, it's one more piece of a massive puzzle that involves all of NATO. Russia can't really do a thing about any of this. Everything that Denmark is doing, from its inspections to its increased Baltic Sea militarization, is being done on Denmark's territory. It has the right to do all of this, and it's working under international and EU frameworks to hinder Russia's shadow fleet. It remains to be seen how effective Denmark's new inspection-based strategy is for dealing with shadow fleet ships. They won't stop Putin's ancient vessels on their own, but the extra pressure is always going to be a problem for Putin, a problem that he isn't going to solve. Instead, Putin is forced to rely on hybrid warfare and indirect attacks against NATO, all of which will only fuel more responses like the ones Denmark is making in the Baltic Sea. Now, the real reason why Russia is secretly attacking NATO becomes clear. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to Warzone Party if you want to watch more videos covering what is happening in the Baltic Sea.